think I'm going to turn off my video then.
Yeah, looks like it's stabilized. We'll hand over to Florent, everybody.
Everybody.
The last plenary.
All right, welcome everyone to our fourth and final plenary. I'm very happy to end the conference with someone who I know a lot of people in this room will be very excited to hear, Adele Goldberg. Adele is a professor at the Department of Psychology at Princeton University. And since her very early work, she's been one of the leading figures in the field of construction grammar, starting in particular with the first monograph I have here, Constructions, a Constructional Approach to Argument Structure, that was published in 1995. And at least in my view, this is one of the main publications that really define the constructional approach to grammar. On a more personal note, as a construction grammarian myself, this is probably the book that I cited the most in my own research. In fact, I'm not even sure there's a single publication of mine that doesn't cite it. And then Adele has also made significant contributions to the field of language acquisition, especially in children, specifically investigating how grammatical constructions are learned. There was a prominent aspect of her two other books. Yeah. Such a fine boy. Constructions at Work and the more recent Explain Me This, published last year, which is also the title of her plenary. So I suspect we'll hear a lot about language acquisition and constructions in this talk. Adele, thank you so much again for accepting our invitation, and moreover for accepting to give your keynote in this such unusual virtual setting. We're very honored and excited to have you here today, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Florent. It's so nice to get such a nice introduction from you. I'm going to be citing some of your work, and it's a pleasure to give a talk here. I have to say, there's so many people I admire have been giving talks, and I'm sorry I've missed some of them because of the time difference and because of the parallel sessions. But I would like to start by thanking the organizers who did an amazing job. I'm sure everyone will agree. So this is the organizing committee, and I think I really just want to say, wow. And Eliza, we have had to change all of the Zoom links today. Has been especially amazing at keeping things running smoothly. But to everyone, I just say a big wow. This is, as I was saying to them, to the organizers, I really feel this conference has set a new high bar for how these online conferences should be done. All right, so can you hear me? I'm going to assume you can. Okay. So let me figure out how to do these things, how to do this. I'm going to try to get rid of yeah, okay. All right, and let's see. All right. So what I'm going to do is give a fairly brief introduction to constructions and memory. Several people mentioned memory in their talks, and that I think is a really important move forward. I think we need to understand memory better to understand how language works. And then I'm going to emphasize two main points. One is that our knowledge of constructions amounts to emergent clusters, that our memory is not list-like in any way. And I'm also going to emphasize the role of competition. So you're going to see those three topics as a header during this. Okay. I think that we can gain a huge amount of traction by simply asking a simple question, and that is, what is it we're trying to do? What are language learners? What are language users? What are we all trying to do? And it's clear that we need to understand messages given the forms that we witness. That is, we want to interpret and comprehend language. And we also need to efficiently choose forms given our intended messages for the sake of production. A final thing that we also care about is that we want to conform to the conventions of our community. We want to speak like other people in our group do. And of course, we're members of more than one group, maybe more than one language. And we want to conform to the conventions of each of our communities. Okay, given these simple ideas, it seems to follow directly that we need to learn how to use form-function pairings, where function includes meaning, information structure, pragmatics, social context, all kinds of functional characteristics. And that's really all I mean by constructions. So constructions are the mappings between forms and functions. So that simple definition, I know a lot of you are familiar with this idea, so you know, and you've helped develop it, so please bear with me. But if constructions are learned pairings of form and function, then it's obvious that words are constructions. Milkshake, again, saunter, afraid, they're all constructions. Words with open slots, so that is morphemes, are constructions. So pre followed by any kind of noun that can be construed as having a temporal boundary. So pre-midterm, pre-exam, pre-talk, verb followed by ing, or any number followed by th. So one of fourth, fifth, ith, and so on. And then we have unfilled lexical constructions. So like the noun compound construction, which itself is treated as a noun. So an example there is the UKCLC conference talk screen. And just like we have words that are filled, partially filled, or unfilled, we have idioms that are filled, like spill tea or hug it out. I have some of the verbs in capitals because their inflected form isn't specified. But we also have idioms or collocations that have open slots. So what took you so long to figure out how to do this? Or I hope this message or email finds you well. Those have open slots. And then other idiomatic kinds of constructions are mostly open. So the more you think about it, the less you understand, or the sooner you start, the sooner you finish. The only lexically filled part of that construction is the. And a lot of work on constructionist approaches has focused on words and idioms and idiomatic constructions. But of course, construction it also includes what everyone considers constructions, and that means it includes very general constructions. So like the verb complement construction, which is open, it doesn't need the complementizer that. I've mentioned in a few of these that the constructions are recursive because some people who aren't familiar with the constructionist approach seem to assume that we can't deal with recursion. But of course we can, because the open slot could be of a type that can include the same type as the construction as a whole. So, you know, she thinks that he believes that he knows that they wonder and so on. It can easily be recursive. And the passive construction, of course, is included as a construction, a form function mapping. So I want to emphasize that our long-term memory is vast, and it's also associative, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. So early on, I had followed Fillmore and Kay in defining a construction as a learned combination of form and function, in which I had said some aspect of form or function is not strictly predictable from its component parts. And it's true that if you can find a collocation or a pattern that is not predictable, you certainly know you have a construction. But I added to that definition in 2006 a more usage-based definition, which was, in addition, patterns are retained as constructions, even if they're fully predictable, as long as they occur with sufficient frequency. But now I want to admit that addition really doesn't make a lot of sense. What does it mean that they're retained if they have sufficient frequency? Just think about that for a minute. So let's say you encounter a certain phrase type once. So I'm assuming that our representation of constructions is structured. So that's what this is intended to represent, this internal structure of a construction. So you hear it once. Well, once presumably isn't sufficiently frequent. So that means you don't retain it? What would that mean? Okay, it would be completely forgotten. So you might hear it again. But as far as you're concerned, that's the same as the first time you ever heard it. And it should be forgotten again. So you see where I'm going with that. It doesn't make sense to say that you only retain things if they occur with sufficient frequency. You have to retain a memory trace even upon a very initial exposure. But of course, we don't consciously remember things that we've witnessed forever, and we can assume that they might degrade in memory. Also importantly, the representations become stronger and more fine-tuned, also easier to access consciously. So the first time you witness something, I don't know if you can make it out, I'm going to use my cursor. There's a very faint representation there. Presumably, it's completely unconscious. You can't recall it at will, and it may degrade so that it's completely forgotten over time. But if you hear another example that shares representation space with the first example, that's when you're going to strengthen your representation. And if you continue to hear it, the representation will become stronger and more fine-tuned and easier to access. So this idea, I think, was touched on by Carolyn and also by Gary Oppenheim yesterday. And I think it's just important to keep in mind that representations of constructions have to grow in strength. So luckily, our memories really are vast, and you can see this clearly in a visual paradigm that was an experiment that was done at MIT. So in this experiment, they had participants look at 2,500 pictures of objects. So these were the pictures of objects they showed were, some of them were the ones on the left here. I'm using my cursor to show you. And then after studying these, people were asked, did you see, they would look at completely different objects that were unseen, and they were asked, did you see this before? And people had to decide if they had seen it or not seen it. So when the foils were new objects, people were remarkably good. They were 92% correct. So they also included examples that were harder. They included different exemplars of the same type of thing. So people saw a frame, and then at test, they were shown a different frame. They saw a starfish, and at test, they were shown a different starfish. Here again, though, people were remarkably correct, 88% at the combination of recognizing familiar items and rejecting new exemplars. And in the most striking case, they included images that were the same objects, just in a slightly different state. So the abacus here, this is the one that was shown. And at test, they were shown one that was just slightly different. Or a bread in a bread box and a bread on the edge of a bread box. And here again, people were 87% correct. So our memory is incredibly vast. At the same time, it's clear that we don't learn lists. Instead, new experiences are related to prior experience. That's a very old idea in psychology. It goes without saying. Vygotsky made this point, and everyone who studies concepts and memory understands this point. What does it mean for language? Well, it has implications in many domains. So the idea is that prior knowledge and semantic relationships help guide our learning. So I'm not going to go into this study, but I just want to mention, this is work by Sammy Floyd. She has found that learning a novel word that has multiple related senses, so polysemous word, is easier than learning a new word with unrelated senses. And she tested this in both 4 to 7-year-olds and adults and found that it was easier and the learning advantage remained after a week delay. And I just wanted to mention, I won't talk about this too much today, but we also were interested in testing children on the autism spectrum. And the reason is that children on the autism spectrum are known to have difficulties in noticing relationships. That is, they hyper-attend to differences among exemplars. So they would do presumably especially well on that visual task I just showed you, because the foils would be less distracting to them. So we were curious whether they would also show the polysemy over homonymy advantage in novel word learning. And in fact, we matched 40 kids with autism on how well they did on the homonymy learning, so that they understood the task and they were above chance at learning homonyms, but we found no advantage for polysemy. And that's a line of work that I'm really interested in extending, because I think that it may offer insights as to why this population is the one population, children on the autism spectrum, that has ongoing struggles and delays in language learning. Okay, I'm going to mention a different experiment by Sammy and my colleague Casey Lou Williams that also highlights this idea of prior knowledge and semantic relationships. So this was an eye tracking study. Very young children, these were 2-year-olds, are outfitted with an eye tracker that follows their gaze. And the kids saw a screen with an image like this, and they heard the word cap. And what we were interested in was whether they would tend to look at cap as opposed to the foil, here, this image of glasses. We wanted to know whether 2-year-olds already knew some polysemous items. So on other trials, we included a different sense of cap. So this is another sense of cap, a bottle cap. And then what I'm most interested in for the talk today is we also included cases that are not labeled by the word cap conventionally in English. So if I asked you what this thing was, you're more likely to say lid. But it turns out that, well, obviously in this case, this is not unrelated to a cap. And evidence that it is related comes from Spanish, which uses the same word tapa to refer to this kind of lid as other caps, like baseball caps. And we found other cases of Spanish words that included one of the English meanings and a novel extension. So for the word sheet, on one trial, kids saw a bed sheet, and we wanted to know if they would look at that. On another trial, they saw a sheet of paper. And on another trial, they saw a leaf. Now, no English speaker would call a leaf a sheet, but we wanted to know if 2-year-olds would look toward the leaf because it was more related to sheet than the foil was. And here's what we found. So first, the conventional polysemy, kids were, okay, their chance is 50%. That is that their eye gaze would go to both of the entities on any trial equally. They're above chance on both kinds of trials. For the conventional cases, they're higher, meaning that's an indication that they are familiar with the English meanings of cap. And they're more familiar than they are for this one, which is not a conventional English meaning of cap, but they were above chance, meaning they saw the relationship. They understood that this meaning was related to the other meanings of cap. It was a better cap than this other thing, and so they were above chance. Another simple example to show you that we're not learning lists, we're learning clusters, we're learning distributions, comes from an experiment by Tenenbaum and Griffith. So I want you to play this game. So you're gonna win the amount on the card you choose to stop at. Okay, 60 is the first one. Do you want $60? Should you stop? Well, if you're like most people, you don't know, because you don't know what this distribution looks like. Maybe it goes up to 1,000. So you really don't know if 60 is a good place to stop. But the more cards you see, so if I say, okay, I'm gonna keep going, oh, 40, that now gives you a better idea of the underlying distribution. Now you have a better idea. Now at this point, you're likely to stop because you realize that all the cards you've seen have been chosen from a distribution with the high point of 60. That is, we're witnessing exemplars, but we're forming clusters. We're forming these underlying representations as well as retaining the cluster, the individual memories. So the idea is that the domain of a construction is determined by clustering in a hyperdimensional relational space. Let me say by hyperdimensional, I want to point out that the brain has 12 trillion connections. That's 12 followed by 10 zeros. Do I have that right? I think I have that right. No, sorry, 100. Anyway, more than we can count. And so there's many, many ways we can represent things, many dimensions that matter. So induction is determined by the variation that we see, the range of possible cases that we witness, as well as the number of attested cases. So that's the type frequency that many people have talked about. And what also matters is the relationship between the potential coinage, that is the new case, and the attested cases. And I borrow a term from the categorization literature, coverage, to discuss this. But if I give you the, I can help you visualize it. Sorry, I'm just looking at my timer here. Okay. Oh, I have the timer. Okay. So imagine that you've witnessed attested instances. These are the deep blue cases. And you want to know, should you express this intended meaning using the form that's included in this particular cluster or construction? So the potential coinage might not have a form yet. It's located in this space on the basis of its intended message. Again, this is mapped in three-dimensional space, which is absolutely a toy way to see it, but that's all we can visualize. In reality, this is a space that has hundreds of thousands of dimensions. But coverage means we're basically asking, how far do we have to extend our current, our witnessed construction in order to include this potential coinage? And when you look at this figure, you can say, well, you have to extend it pretty far. This particular category defined by the previous exemplars and the new coinage is not well covered. But to decide whether it's really not well covered enough, you really need to compare it to something. So we can look at a similar cluster that has more variability. And now you can see that because of the variability, it's less difficult to include the potential coinage because it's already somewhat variable, and so extending it isn't quite as difficult. What matters especially is how close the potential coinage is to the attested instances in terms of its function. If it's very close, then it's going to generally be easier to include it in that cluster. So the idea of coverage, again, is determined by a combination of variability, type frequency, and the relationship of potential coinages to the attested cases. And the idea is nice because it wraps up these three factors together. So they're not independent of one another. They're all involved in asking, how well is the category you need covered by previously witnessed cases? Okay, so I'm going to give you an example that I think illustrates both the kind of clustering and the attention to individual memories. So this is a construction that Thomas Erbst and I worked on recently. And if I ask you to fill in the blank, it's blank of you to be here, what word comes to mind? I think for most of you, it's going to be, it's nice of you to be here, or possibly it's good of you to be here, especially if you learn British English. Why is that the case? Well, it turns out that nice is the most frequently occurring adjective that occurs in this construction. It only accounts for about 16% of the tokens, but it's more frequent than any other adjective. And you know that if you can come up with nice to fill this construction. Again, that's American English. But we also know, because the instances of this construction cluster together, we also know that it has other constraints. So it's productive, but it generally means that the speaker judges someone's action, human's action. So that is, it's odd to say, it's tall of you to reach the top shelf, because being tall isn't, we don't evaluate people on how tall they are. It's not an evaluative adjective. We can say, it's big of you to reach the top shelf, but in that case, big has to mean generous, essentially, because that's the only way big can be evaluative. Notice too that we don't judge inanimate objects unless we're using them metaphorically. So you wouldn't say, it was good of the dishwasher to save money, or sorry, it was good of the dishwasher to save water. Because the of phrase has to be construed as an agent. So that, and in that construction too, you can use many different adjectives. You can use that was charming of him to say that. You can use adjectives you've never seen before. But importantly, language is not a free-for-all. You can't just put any word in any construction and hope that as long as the listener will understand it. So to illustrate that, I want to turn your attention to these gaps, these cases that are interpretable. We just don't say it this way. This is just not the conventional way that native English speakers use language. So we don't say, she explained him the story, even though she told him a story is fine. We don't say, he vanished the rabbit, even though he hid or banished the rabbit is fine. We don't say, she considered to go, even though we can say she wanted to go. And we don't say the asleep boy, even though we can say the astute boy or the sleeping boy. So how do we account for these cases? Clustering isn't enough because these cases are interpretable, and a priori, there's no reason that a coinage couldn't be included in the cluster of cases that, to include these cases. So the idea I want to now explain in more detail is that we learn to avoid those formulations through competition, through the idea of what I'd like to call statistical preemption. That is that people learn to avoid certain novel formulations by systematically witnessing a competing alternative. So statistical is included because this is assumed to not occur on a one trial basis, but by repeatedly witnessing one formulation instead of another to express a particular meaning. Okay, so you're familiar with this idea in many cases. So in words, this is not controversial. I mentioned that you can add th to any number. You can say fourth, fifth, 100th, ith, gazillionth, n+1th, but we don't say third. And we know why we don't say third. We don't say threeth. We don't say threeth. We know why we don't, because we say third. Third, statistically preempted, threeth. We can also say baby gorilla, baby aardvark, and this is very productive. But we don't say baby cat. The reason is the same, because we have a better term to express that meaning, kitten. Now you might say that that baby cat is not as bad as threeth, and that I would agree with you, but that's really because there are contexts where you might construe baby cat to mean something slightly different than kitten. For instance, if you're really emphasizing the baby aspect, or if you're comparing baby cats to baby gorillas to baby aardvarks, in that case, you may want to express the word baby. So that is the message in context is what's really important. Another case, again, noun compounds are very productive. We say raspberry jam, apricot jam, fig jam, but we don't say orange jam, and that's because we have the word marmalade. So the idea is that that's also the explanation for why we don't say explain her something, because we've systematically heard explain something to her in contexts where we might have expected to hear the double object construction. Now, this idea has been considered before, early on by Melissa Bowerman, for example, and she had dismissed this idea because she said, but each construction has its own function. And that's true. So tell him something doesn't mean the same thing as tell something to him. But that's actually not a problem for statistical preemption. In fact, it's an advantage because statistical preemption means that you hear one construction when you expected to hear a different one given the message in context. And because each construction has its own function, its own, it's useful for particular kinds of messages and contexts, if you don't hear it, you have a way of knowing that you have an expectation that isn't met. Okay, so I'm gonna talk about this in a couple different ways to try to make it more clear. Okay, so we know something like this happens in memory. So there's a phenomena that I find really intriguing. It's referred to as retrieval-induced forgetting, which is probably not the best name. But in the memory literature, this is a phenomena discovered by Anderson, Bjork, and Bjork. They had people study lists of words, and the words came from different categories. So they studied a number of different fruits, a number of different clothing types, a number of different professions, and so on. Studied this list, and then they entered a retrieval phase. And in that retrieval phase, they asked them, they provided partial cues, something like fruit, oh. Now here's the interesting thing. Once you say fruit, you're going to activate prototypical fruits, which includes apple. But apple, of course, is not compatible with the O. So what you're going to have to retrieve is orange. But because you're retrieving orange and not apple, you have to, at this moment, suppress apple. So a test, the test involves a free response. You're asked simply to, I see there's a hand raised. I don't know if you can ask something. Feel free to. Oh, there are a bunch of questions. Is there a way to let them ask? I can't see your questions, I'm afraid. Okay, I'll continue. Maybe write down the question and we'll get to it at the end.
Yeah, we'll do questions at the end.
Okay.
I don't know why people are raising their hands, but
okay.
Just go on.
Okay. So thanks, Warren. So at test, people are asked to simply recall fruits, recall clothing. And what's striking is, okay, so here's the kind of data that has been replicated many, many times. If people had practiced orange, that's obviously going to be better remembered. They had just said it. So it's practiced, the memory for it is stronger, and they will tend to recall it in the free recall test. But compared to the unpracticed and uncompetitive cases like jacket, so jacket was not used in retrieval and nothing like jacket was used in retrieval. Apple, the competitor of orange, is less likely to be recalled. That is, its memory seems to be suppressed in this context. So the idea is that these are competitors, and if orange is selected, in this context, apple becomes suppressed. So how is this related to language? The idea is, in this kind of context, you might expect to hear either the magician made the rabbit disappear or the magician disappeared the rabbit. Notice the magician is directly causing the rabbit to disappear, which is appropriate for the simple causative transitive. But people are reliably going to hear the magician made the rabbit disappear, the periphrastic causative, because disappear only allows that construction. So what's going to happen? Upon hearing that construction, people's representation or their memory for this use of disappear, the periphrastic causative, in this kind of context will grow, and the transitive use of disappear will weaken for use in this context. So that's the idea of statistical preemption. Now, okay, so again, people learn to avoid certain novel formulations by systematically witnessing a competing alternative. So there's an interesting effect that's been replicated several times. I think Brooks and Tomasello might have been the first to find this. So if I ask you, which is more acceptable? Neither of these are conventional, they're both novel, but which do you find less bad? The performance giggled the audience or the performance laughed the audience? So most people will judge the first one, giggle, to be less bad. Notice giggle is a less frequent verb than laugh. So one possible explanation for this is that, well, you've heard laugh in the intransitive construction more often. And so you don't like to extend it in any other construction. So this idea has been proposed, in fact, to account for that kind of finding. I like to refer to this as conservatism via entrenchment, meaning people only use verbs in ways they've heard them used before. And the more they've heard them, the more stuck they are in that particular context. So that doesn't sound unreasonable, but of course, we do use laugh in different cases, in different constructions. So these are examples from Twitter. These are novel uses of high frequency verbs. So daddy laughed me off the couch, or is everyone baking their is everyone baking away their boredom during social isolation? Or the driver was suffering an allergy attack and sneezed his way into the hind end of a truck. Or no one has ever been hated into agreement after all. Or you might as well fart your hands dry. So in all of these cases, the verbs are quite frequent and not in these constructions. And yet all of these constructions are attested and they sound relatively okay. I'm going to give you one more example because I can't resist. I give a shout out to Remy Van Tripp for noticing this one. So this was a tweet. Someone was explaining how reply guys operate. These are guys who reply to your tweets. And she said, you tweet some facts and a reply guy will actually it's you. I thought that's a great example of how you can create new verbs. All right, that's really not germane to the point, but I couldn't resist sharing that. All right, so in a study, Clarice Robinal attempted to find out whether higher frequency verbs are always less flexible. Because the idea of statistical preemption predicts that the reason that she giggled the audience is better is because we've heard the competing alternative less often. We've heard she made someone giggle less often than we've heard she made someone laugh. So what Clarice did was she generated novel sentences with high and low frequency verbs. So if I ask you to paraphrase, the chef coated ranch dressing over the salad, this is what we did, people tend to agree on a paraphrase. They tend to say the chef coated the salad with ranch dressing. Not everyone, of course. Someone said the chef coated dressing onto the salad, but people tended to agree. We got 20 or 40, I can't remember, speakers to paraphrase each of these sentences. So because people tend to agree, we say this sentence has a competing alternative. If instead I asked you to paraphrase, the editorial embarrassed the poor man out of town, you can come up with paraphrases, but you're all going to come up with different paraphrases. And that's exactly what we found. People paraphrased this sentence in different ways. There was no clear competing alternative. So this case we'll describe as has no readily available conventional competing alternative. So we had two groups of sentences. We had a high frequency verb and a lower frequency verb for each case. And then we binned the sentences into whether they had a competing alternative or not. Okay, we had several different sentences for each condition. You don't have to read all of these. And then we had people do an acceptability rating. So it was just a 5-point Likert scale, and we did this on Mechanical Turk. We also included conventional uses of the verbs. I should say nobody saw more than one sentence with any of the given verbs. So for Ashley was terribly mortified, we expect that to be very acceptable, of course, because that's the construction we've heard mortified used in before. So this is what she found. I'm going to look at it case by case. So for the conventional cases, they're very acceptable, as we expect. And you see that the high frequency verbs are slightly more acceptable than the low frequency verbs. And that's generally what you expect. That people find it more acceptable when the sentence is more familiar. So people care about the familiarity of sentences. When sentences have a competing alternative, we replicated the effect that I mentioned before with giggle being preferred over laughed in the novel construction. So both of these conditions here were novel sentences, and we confirmed that they were novel types using coca corpus. So here you see that the acceptability flips. The lower frequency verbs in the novel use were more acceptable. But I also want to draw your attention to the cases that had no competing alternative. So these are cases where there's no readily available different way to say it. Now the verb frequency doesn't matter. The novel cases without a competing alternative are less acceptable than the conventional cases. They're novel, and people they prefer conventional over novel, but they're more acceptable than the cases that had a competing alternative. And the verb frequency didn't matter because neither verb had been preempted. Okay, so the verb frequency only makes a difference if the sentence has a competing alternative. So to summarize what we've seen, we all prefer familiar formulations, and it's the verb in the competing construction that's relevant to unacceptability. Okay, I'm going to go over another case. It's an older example of work that we've done, but it provides a really nice microcosm of these ideas, so I think it's worth mentioning. Okay, so there's a subtle restriction on a class of adjectives that start with an unstressed schwa, and that is we don't like to use them before nouns or attributively. It's odd to say an asleep child, an afloat ship, an alive monster, and so on. This is not predicted by their semantics, so it's fine to say the sleeping child or the scared man, even though it's odd to say the afraid man. And it's also not predicted by their phonology because other adjectives that start with an unstressed schwa are fully acceptable, like the adult male or an acute sickness. There's a historical reason for the dispreference, and that is that most of the adjectives that avoid prenominal use used to be prepositional phrases. And as prepositional phrases, we don't expect them to occur before nouns. We wouldn't say the on drugs man. Of course, people don't know the history of English, but we respect the statistics from the way people used to use it. And that continues through generations, it seems. So the word afraid didn't come from on frayed. In fact, afraid was a past participle, but we've assimilated it to the cluster of cases of a adjectives because it's relevantly similar. I should say all of the a adjective cases that resist occurring before nouns start with an unstressed schwa and have a recognizable root. Okay, so the idea is that learners record statistics about particular items distribution, and constructional generalizations emerge from learners categorizing over the input. Okay, I see I'm running out of time, so I'm gonna explain these, and then I'd like to show you a 2-minute video, and then I'll stop. And I know we can go till 5:30 your time, so we'll have plenty of time for questions. Okay, so in this study, there were three conditions, and another reason I wanted to present it today is because 2 of the conditions have been redone by a new group, Christian Navarro-Torres, Julie Ducius, and Judy Kroll, and they've replicated the findings, so that's always encouraging to see. So this was an experiment with Jeremy Boyd, and it was very simple. We showed people cases like this, and we read the adjectives, so dead, alive. One of the animals moved to the star, the screen went blank, and then we asked people which fox moved to the star. And there were 4 conditions. We had the a adjective cases like asleep. We had near synonyms like sleepy. And then we included nonsense a adjectives, adax, and again, we read them out loud so people knew how to pronounce them. And we had nonsense non-adjectives like chamby. We also included fillers that were designed and successfully did elicit one or the other construction we were after. So we wanted to know, are people going to say the asleep dog or the dog that's asleep? Okay, and so with prototypical adjectives, they reliably produced the bad dog with all of these. And with past tense verbs, they had no choice. They had to use the preemptive construction, the relative clause, like the dog that bites. Okay, so we gave them, in the first study, we gave them 6 practice trials that just showed them how to do the task. And then what's important is the test block. And here you can see that people did avoid using afraid and asleep prenominally. So the y-axis is the percentage of prenominal productions. And so this replicates our intuitions. But the question is, what do they do with the novel cases? And here again, we see affect was produced before nouns less often than chammy was. So that's a sign of clustering, that they to some extent clustered affect with the other a adjectives. But if you're keeping your eye on the y-axis, you notice that the effect is not nearly as strong for these novel a adjectives. And so if you put them together, you can see asleep was much more strongly dispreferred. So in a second study, we introduced preemptive context for the novel a adjectives. So here, sorry, this one, I don't know why it's covered up, but it should say affect. So now Zeki affect and the affect fox moved to the star. But in the exposure before the experiment started, people heard, so here you might say the fox that's affect moved to the star. And in that practice block, unlike in the first experiment, 2 of the 4 novel adjectives we used occurred in this preemptive context in the relative clause. And we also included examples before nouns so that it wasn't overall priming that played a role. Okay. The test block was the same as before and included 4 new novel adjectives. So this is what we had seen before without the preemptive exposure. This is what we see with the preemptive exposure. at this point, if people are given some indication that affect is used, has been used in a preemptive context like asleep would be, they include it in the cluster that includes the other A adjectives. In fact, there's no difference between these two cases. And if we look within the novel A adjectives, you can see there's no difference between the two verbs that they witnessed and the other two verbs. So they're, in effect, generalizing the novel A adjectives to include all of them within the group of A adjectives, and they're avoiding using them prenominally. Okay, one last context. It's very simple. We wanted to know, it was so powerful. We wanted to know if people are savvy enough to know when a context is truly preemptive, because otherwise they might avoid things too much. So for this third study, we during the exposure phase, we presented things like, oh, here you might say the fox that's a dax and proud of itself moved to the star. Now notice by including proud of itself, there's a reason for the relative clause that has nothing to do with a dax, because you can't say the proud of itself fox. So that's why you might not say the effect and proud of itself fox. That is, this is not a real preemptive exposure. There's a different reason for the relative clause. So we wanted to know if people would be smart and ignore this in their own productions. So here's the first experiment where they didn't have preemptive exposure. And in fact, with this pseudo-preemptive exposure, they did ignore it. So they recognized that this was not actually preemptive. And I should say that this is evidence against the idea that we only use words the way we've heard them, because effect was only heard in a relative clause, but we didn't stick to a relative clause because there was a good reason that that appeared that way. All right, so I know you're all scared when it says interim summary. We're going to use this as the final summary. So we record the statistics of language. We cluster input. Statistical preemption means we avoid certain formulations because an alternative formulation is systematically used instead. And we're smart about what counts as a preemptive context. Okay, I'm almost done. Yang challenged this idea of statistical preemption because he went through a corpus of speech to 3-year-olds and found that they didn't hear all of the A adjectives in a preemptive context before they were 3 years old. And I have no qualms about that result. I think that I agree that they probably don't hear all of the A adjectives in preemptive context before they're 3 years old. But it turns out, and this is based on a senior thesis study by Jessica Howe, that what you're looking at here is the prenominal uses, attributive prenominal uses for non-A adjectives and for A adjectives. And what you expect is the attributive adjective use to go down, or at least to separate from other adjectives. And you can see people don't actually know this restriction. Children don't know it until they're 10 years old. So it does take time. Okay, so I'm not going to have time, unfortunately. I wanted to go through the experiments that Florent did that show, again, the idea of clustering and statistical preemption. I think they're wonderful studies. They're a little involved, and so I'm going to skip them for now, but I highly recommend that you look at them. I'm just going to now turn to the last 3 slides. Remember that first polysemy study I mentioned with the 2-year-olds? The kids looked to the lid, even though we don't call lids caps. And now I just want to ask the question, how do kids ever learn not to use cap for lids? How do any of us learn that? And the idea of statistical preemption is clear. It's that we learn other words, better words for those kinds of entities. We learn the word lid and leaf and goggles and necklace and croissant and globe for these words. Okay, so it's possible to model these kinds of effects, and I'm happy to go over that during the questions, but I'm afraid of straining your patience. And I do want to show this little video, and it's basically an advertisement for the book, but it I think gives you some of the key insights in a way that's not tiring. So I'll just present that and then I'll take questions. Oh no. Okay, and I thank you for your patience, and I really want to also thank all of my lab, many of them I've mentioned, and thank you for your patience at the end of a very rich and wonderful conference. Okay, I'm happy to take questions.
Okay. Thank you very much, Adele. This very fascinating talk. Wait, I'm gonna, okay. Yeah. So I'm not sure which question came first. There are some in the Q&A, some in the chat. So I'm gonna start with the chat. Okay, there are. Sorry, I have a very small window. Okay. So there's a question from Mai. An example that occurred to me about an odd use of a word like she considered to go is something that you may see in a non-native speaker of the language, most probably because they do not have the same amount of exposure to the language. Do you think that the principle of induction applies here as well for a non-native speaker?
So that is such a great question. That's something we've been working on. I have a wonderful grad student, Karina Tachihara, who's working on exactly that issue. Why is it so hard for non-native speakers to learn those very weird edge cases, those like explain something to her? It's another mistake that non-native speakers make. And in the work that we've done, it looks like the statistical preemption seems to be less strong, or more, they seem to be less sensitive to statistical preemption for grammatical cases. the native speakers are, and we have some ideas about why that we're working on. So there's a lot to be said about that. I think it's really interesting. Yeah, I'm happy to say more if people are interested, but I don't want to start a whole new talk unless you are.
So then Mark is asking, what for you are the biggest challenges or the most promising areas in construction grammar today? I'm very interested in the answer as well.
Yeah, so, you know, I think there's so much to do. I think we need to understand this clustering better. I don't think there's going to be an easy answer. So, you know, I have started to do some computational modeling because I think that it's unavoidable these days. But at the same time, we don't have a good representation for semantics. Like no one knows how to represent complicated words like extradite or conference. There's just no, you can say what words are related to it, but that's not capturing its meaning. Ultimately, it would be nice to understand how the clustering occurs more. I think studying memory is a good route to understanding language better. I think a lot of the same puzzles occur when we think about conceptual reasoning. I've become really partial to experimental work. So, you know, there's sociolinguistics is another like key area that people are making great contributions to. I think looking at what's being found in laboratory phonology. So, you know, how does what we know about concrete cases, words, or phonology, how does it scale up? Are really some of the more outstanding questions in my mind.
Then a question from Lauren. I'd be very curious to hear more about how statistical preemption and the tolerance principle differ in terms of their predictions.
Oh, you pressed my button. The tolerance principle is a theory by Charles Yang. And the theory is based on the idea that, so he's also trying to account for how we learn to avoid certain cases like explain me this, or and I have a section in the book that addresses it, and we have a new paper coming out that disproves his idea. But okay, so the short version is he wants to say that you remember all of the exceptional cases in a list and you count them and you access them in order of the most frequent one first. So they're an ordered list in terms of frequency, and you go down them, and only when you've gone down all of them can you go to a general rule. And he gives a number based on the assumption that that is how we retrieve word meanings. I see. It's such a good question. Let me, instead of trying to answer it, okay, sorry. He doesn't use clusters. He doesn't use semantics. He doesn't use, and he has strict numerical thresholds, and that's not relevant. What matters is, what's the best choice? What's your best option? If you don't have a better option, you have to get creative, and we do. And there's no use of competition in Yang's work. So if you want to send me an email, I can send you a paper, and I'm happy to discuss it more, but I find it really frustrating. I think it's way oversimplified.
All right, then Yan Ju wanted to ask a question orally, so I think Zoom allows that. I'm going to try this. Okay, Ian,
So I just prefer to give a question vocally. Thank you for your very enlightening talk. It was very helpful. My major concern was related to the competition theory. So your competition theory is that basically if there's an expression A and a competing construction B, and if B is already used, then we tend to not use A because there's already B. But I think that has the danger of circularity, because when we're trying to explain why do we say B and not A, Well, that's because we say B and not A. So that is inherently somewhat circular. I mean, if we have external evidence like Old English, why that historically became the case, why B became to be used and not A, then that can be saved from circularity. But if we only have that competition theory, then that by itself cannot explain why we are using B and not A in the first place. So that
Well,
was my major question.
that's a fair point, and that's why we do experiments where we can vary it, right? So we could see that in one case they did use the novel word productively in a new construction, except if they had witnessed it used a different way, and then they did not. And so that was true in the adjective study. It was also true in the work that I didn't get to talk about in with Florent.
Yeah, so if I may elaborate that, sorry, if I may, maybe we should also have more look at diachronic aspect of that development, because the Old English example for the adjectives beginning with A is completely acceptable for explaining why they tend to be used in such a way, but experiment are synchronic in principle. So if we have more diachronic evidence why B tends to be used and not A, and that saves the argument from circularity, because that explains why B is used in the first place and not A.
Well, I disagree there. So there's a reason, there's a historical reason why the asleep man is not used, and that's because at a certain point the asleep was a prepositional phrase, but people don't know that today, and they still don't use it. And so my question is, how do people learn that constraint? The historical explanation in that case is not one of competition. But in other cases, so I am actually working on a project right now to explain a different case through diachrony, and it does involve competition. And that's the case of how so people used to say father and mother and grandfather and grandmother and pa and ma and nephews and nieces. If you see the pattern, they used to have the male first in all of those cases. And today, as you probably realize, we systematically use the reverse. And if you look diachronically, you can see how they flipped, and you can see the role of competition and token frequency of each cases. So that's the next project. So I take your point that diachrony can be very interesting. I just think it won't apply for the A adjective case. Thank you.
Caroline had a question. Let me scroll up. And of course I can find it now. Okay, sorry, I can't find it. I'm just gonna take another. Thank you, Professor Goldberg, for your wonderful talk from Thomas. I wonder how much of your discussion on the notion of competition converges with the ideas behind the competition model by McWhinney and Bates, where acquisition is based on a reliability and strength of available cues. Is that actually similar to the question that was just asked?
No, I think that's not related. No. So yeah, Bates and McWhinney, yeah, they're my heroes. Absolutely. So yeah, I cite them all the time when I talk about competition. If I missed the reference, I'm sorry. I think they had it very, very right. Yeah.
So thanks, Adam, for copying Caroline's question. Amazing talk, thank you. My question, we traditionally talk about different types of linguistic knowledge: phonemes, words, morphosyntactic rules, pragmatic rules, and conventions. Do you think any of these exist, or is it constructions all the way up and all the way down?
I do think it's constructions all the way up and all the way down. I think, so in phonology, people talk about templatic phonology, and in morphology, they talk about these words with open slots. So among the phonologists I'm talking about, I do think there's pragmatics that isn't conventional, but often pragmatics becomes conventional, and then it becomes constructional. So I think that you can look at all of those aspects in terms of constructions. And I think it's useful because those levels interact oftentimes. We use particular phonology, or we expect particular phonology in particular contexts with other speakers, other kinds of speakers. So I don't think the levels can be kept independent. Thanks, that's a great question.
I'm gonna take a question from Hoover now. Another question by Lauren Ackerman. Regarding laugh versus giggle in the novel construction, is there a practical difference between giggle being lower frequency overall and laugh being higher frequency in transitive and ergative frames?
So, okay, so exactly, I'm sorry it wasn't clear. So the original interpretation of that finding was that that was the reason. That because laugh was used intransitively more often than giggle, that it was less likely to be used in any other way. And what I'm arguing is that it's a little different than that. It's not that it's less likely to be used in any other way. It's less likely to be used, or sorry, it's not the intransitive use that competes. It's the periphrastic causative that competes. That is, we know how to say that particular message, and we don't need a simple transitive. So frequencies matter, but it's frequency of the competing alternative that matters.
All right, I'm gonna take one last question. Oh, a question that was asked much earlier on, actually. So I'm sorry, we don't have much more time for Q&As, but you can, if you want to ask more questions, there's the session Q&A space on Hoover. I'm sure Adele will be pleased to answer any questions there. So question by Christian Michel, can construction grammar be extended to discourse behind a single sentence?
Yes, absolutely. And there's some exciting work that does that. So in fact, it's an old idea. Fillmore had talked about story grammars. And if you think about it, things like once upon a time, then there's a story, happily ever after. That's a construction where there's a huge open slot in the middle. But I think absolutely, there are conventional pairings of form and function. You know, technically songs are constructions, poems that are memorized are constructions. So there's no reason that it has to be contained in a single sentence.
And lastly, really, the very last one, a follow-up to this from Marina Zukova, and to gestures. What about gestures?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, so I've avoided gestures. It's unclear to me how, well, to the extent that they're conventional, absolutely. Yes.
And Gabriella, okay, and then there's really the last one. Same as for action too. Not sure what you mean. Do you want to speak up maybe? I can give you speaking powers. Oh, okay. Well, I have to promote you to panelists. Okay, well, that's fine, I guess. Oh, now she left. Okay, what did I do? Okay, maybe she'll be back.
You write questions. I'll spend a couple hours in the afternoon if you like trying to answer all of them.
I just promoted Gabriella to panelist.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I can't see her.
Are you there, Gabriella?
Hello? No, she's still a regular, she's still an attendee. Anyway. Okay. Yeah, I think we should end it there. So again, there's a space on Hoover where you can ask more questions if you'd like. So thank you very much, Adele.
Oh, thank you. This was much less painful than the first one.
Glad. Thanks.
Okay.
All right. So I do have some concluding words. I'm gonna try to keep it short because we appreciate that many of you might be zoomed out and very tired after 3 long days listening to academic talks on a computer, which is not the most ideal setting. But I do have, I do want to say a few concluding words if you don't mind. Okay, so bear with me for a sec as I'm setting things up. Okay, can you guys see this?
Yes.
Thanks. I can't see the chat now anymore. Anyway, okay, well, great. So yeah, we did want to make a few concluding remarks, if you don't mind. So just like maybe thinking back to the next couple of months. So I remember quite fondly how innocent we were just only a few months ago, blissfully unaware that the world was about to be turned upside down. And then in March, we were starting to see signs that the rest of the year would not play out as we had planned. And the fate of this conference was very uncertain. And there were many different things we could have done. We could have postponed a few months, we could have postponed a year, or we could simply have canceled it altogether, or we could go virtual, which some conferences were already considering. And retrospectively, I think that we have made the right decision. I'm very pleased we made this decision, really. It's been such a delight to see all of this come together. We are quite proud, I have to say, I want to say, and honored that we were able to provide a forum for cognitive linguistics this year, a year that has been very difficult for all of us. And at the very least, I can say that it was a very interesting experience. I'm sure not just for us, for the organizers, but I'm sure for all of us, for the audience as well, for the plenary speakers and everyone else involved. So there are a number of highlights in this conference that I'd like to acknowledge. So of course, it's not an exhaustive list, but just to reminisce on the amazing things that have happened. So we started with amazing pre-conference workshops that were very successful and very well attended. We had 4 thought-provoking plenary talks, keynote presentations. Thank you so much again to our plenary speakers for agreeing to this. We started in the morning with yoga. Some of you were involved in yoga. We had so yesterday was the social day, was a social program. We had a virtual tour of Birmingham that unfortunately I couldn't attend, but I hear was very successful and very enjoyable. And yesterday evening was the funniest pub quiz, which was so much fun. It was also a big success. Very glad I participated in that one, hosted by our now famous quiz fairy, Gerardo Ortega. Thank you very much, Gerardo, for the fun we had. Right. So now, unfortunately, we couldn't have, sorry, I have to go back. So obviously we had the inevitable technical glitches, even though we truly did our best to anticipate as much as possible. But on the whole, I think things have been running quite smoothly. I mean, incredibly. And we would like to thank the audience. Thank you so much for being patient and accommodating with all of this, and for bearing with us when things have run, let's say, less smoothly. So now it is by far not our own doing, and we have a lot of people to thank for this success, as Bodo mentioned at the opening ceremony, and I think they deserve to be credited and thanked again, because without them, this entire event wouldn't have been possible. So huge thanks to the chairs and the host. Their job has been maybe harder than we anticipated, with the technical glitches and having to manage the attendance and everything. So thank you very much for making the experience as enjoyable as possible, and for helping us putting this together. That was really an amazing job. Thank you. Thanks to our student helpers, again, were really a key source of help in this context. So they were involved with the help desk. That's a screenshot from the help desk, which I hear was very successful. But also, especially with the Zoom breakdown, they were very helpful in creating new rooms on the fly and helping us wherever they were needed. So thank you very much. That's very much appreciated. Huge thanks to the student helpers. Thanks to the organizational committee for their respective contributions. And I think very special thanks should go to our event managers, Eliza and Matt, who have done a really stellar job making sure that this event comes together and runs as smoothly as possible. Yeah, like I can't find the words to thank you for all the hard work. I've got a special thing for you. So one thing I've missed in this conference was applause. We couldn't really do applause. I tried at some point, but it wasn't really possible. So I give you, you're the only ones getting virtual applause. Did you hear that? I hope you heard that. Otherwise, it was a bit.
I did. Thank you.
Thank you. All right.
Thank you.
Right, okay. Thanks to our plenary speakers again for their wonderful job delivering these 4 keynotes. Thank you so much. And thanks to the workshop organizers for the very successful, very valuable work at the beginning of the conference. Okay, and most of all, or, you know, last but not least, thank you, all of you, the audience, for being with us for these 3 days or 5 days, for bearing with us with all the technical issues. I think you've been, or most of you at least, have been very patient. So thank you so much. So before you leave, we would like very much to hear your feedback, to hear your thoughts about the conference, what you liked, what you didn't like. So you must have received today an invitation to complete a survey that's on SurveyMonkey. There's a link that was sent to you via email. It will be available for, well, until about mid-August. So yeah, we would very much like to know what you thought of the conference and what we could have done better, and so on and so forth. So please, that's very valuable for us. So if that were face-to-face, a physical conference, I would say safe travels, but I think for going to the computer to another part of your home, that doesn't really apply. So I'll just say, take care, be safe, especially right now, especially in these crazy times we're living. And maybe we will see you, hopefully we will see you in another event, maybe the next UKCLC, who knows. All right, thank you very much and goodbye.